Good morning, sister girl. It is November 18th, 2023, and we're going to have a mini Bible study this morning. I know, let me break it down to you on how all of this came about. So this morning, so I have these prayer cards, right? It says, Prayers to Share, 100 Passed Along Notes for Believing Bigger by Marshawn Evans Daniels. And what I like to do is I say a little prayer before I flip through them and pull a prayer card out. And not only do I pray for myself, but I pray for, because sometimes I share it on Instagram in my stories. And so I pray for whoever God chooses to speak to through these prayer cards, and that it would reach the heart that it's meant for. This morning's prayer card is, and then I also date them, because I have a little journal that I tape these on, and it's just like a journal, like a prayer journal type of situation. And I like to have it because I like to flip through them and just see the faithfulness of God, and it's just a reminder for me, and it's just been a blessing. But today's prayer, it says, I'm praying that instead of fear and frustration, you will have the mindset and heart you need to navigate transition with peace and forward-focused faith. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you. Psalms 32:8. Seek God's heart. Ask for patience, perspective, and endurance. And may you believe bigger than the obstacle in front of you. Isn't it so cute? And it's just so adorable. Like the colors and awesome. And then what I do sometimes is if I have a thought, or like in my own prayer, I'll write something in the back of it. And I didn't this morning, because then when I read this, I was meditating on it. I'm like, maybe I should share a little bit on what I shared last night during our Bible study gathering. So I lead a Bible study group every Friday on Zoom at 7:30. So for any woman who would like to join, you can feel free to message me, and I'll send you the link. Again, I like to say, and I like to just share how it's not an obligation. Like you can join one Friday, and if you're not able to join the next, that's okay. But it's an option for those that would like to join. So I will be reading from the book of Exodus and chapter 12. Yes, chapter 12. Just to give you a little bit of context, which I will be reading anyway, so you'll have a better understanding. But this is a time when the Israelites were living in Egypt. Israelites were considered to be God's people, and they were living in Egypt as slaves. And they were crying out to God. God then chose Moses, who then God used to go to Pharaoh, which Pharaoh was like the ruler of Egypt and the ruler of these slaves. And God said, I'm gonna use you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses felt inadequate. He felt like the call that God was having him, like the calling of God was just too impossible for him. Like, how am I going to do this? He had a stuttering issue. He just felt like he wasn't worthy to be used by God in such a way that seemed impossible for him, but possible for God. So there was a whole bunch of things that happened. And then finally, Pharaoh let the Israelites go. And so this is where we start. But let me just also say, what I found interesting as I began reading this is how much so many of us can resonate with the Israelites. Like I'm reading this, right? And I'm like, wow, these Israelites were so disobedient. You know, they lacked a lot of faith many times. They lacked trust. They complained. They also cried out to God. You know, they went through it. They were in the wilderness. You know, I think about just what this journey has been like for me and for so many of us. And I feel like so many will be able to learn from just these passages that I'm going to be sharing today. And I just pray that it does. I really do. Okay. So I'll be reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37. I'm going to be skipping some parts because I want to get to the part where I want to share what it looks like for us being in the wilderness season and what it looked like for them during that time. So the Israelites leave Egypt. So I'm reading it. Let me just also say, I'm reading in the Good News translation because as I am listening to the Bible in chronological order, that is the translation that I'm using. And so that's the version that I'm using to read. It says, the Israelites leave Egypt. The Israelites set out on foot from Ramesses for Succoth. Again, I don't know how to pronounce these words, so just follow along. There were about 600,000 men, not counting women and children. A large number of other people and many sheep, goats, and cattle also went with them. They baked unleavened bread from the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for they had been driven out of Egypt so suddenly that they did not have time to get their food ready or to prepare leavened dough. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years. On the day the 430 years ended, all the tribes of the Lord's people left Egypt. It was a night when the Lord kept watch to bring them out of Egypt. This same night is dedicated to the Lord for all time to come as a night when the Israelites must keep watch. Fast forward, they leave, right? And it says in Exodus 13, starting verse 17, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. When the king of Egypt let the people go, God did not take them by the road that goes up to coast to Philistia, although it was the shortest way. God thought, I do not want the people to change their minds and return to Egypt when they see that they're going to have to fight. Instead, he led them in a roundabout way through the desert toward the Red Sea. The Israelites were armed for battle. Moses took the body of Joseph with him, as Joseph had made the Israelites solemnly promise to do. Joseph had said, when God rescues you, you must carry my body with you from this place. Because he didn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wanted to be buried in the promised land, the land that God had promised him, his father Isaac, and Abraham, right? So here they are leaving Egypt and being led to the promised land. And so it continues to say, the Israelites left Succoth and camped in Etham on the edge of the desert. During the day, the Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud to show them the way. And during the night, he went in front of them in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel night and day. The pillar of cloud was always in front of the people during the day, and the pillar of fire at night. So here is God. They're being led out of Egypt, and although they're traveling, God is using a pillar of cloud, right? It says, during the day, the Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud to show them the way. They're being led by God, right? And then during the night, he went in front of them in a pillar of fire. So they're not, they don't have to figure this out on their own. They have God to guide them in doing that. So then chapter 14, it says, and let me just also say, it was interesting to see or to read that it says, God did not take them by the road that goes up to coast to Philistia, although it was the shortest way. So God could have chosen the shortest way for them to get to the Red Sea. But instead it said, God thought, I do not want the people to change their minds and return to Egypt when they see that they're going to fight. They're going to have to fight. So I think about just what my journey has been like, right? Where I'm like, man, why did this have to happen? Or why did that have to happen? And just like God felt it necessary to lead them on a path that was beneficial for them, although they may have felt like it wasn't. But God's like, listen, if I take them this route, and then when they change their mind, they're going to be quick to go back to their old ways. Go back to in this case, to Egypt, where they were slaves. But instead, I'm going to take them a different route where they're going to, it says, I do not want the people to change their minds and return to Egypt when they see that they're going to have to fight. So now God is preparing them, right? And they have no idea what's coming. So anyway, it goes on, right? 14, it says, crossing the Red Sea. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the Red Sea, near Baal Zephon. These names, they're hard. The king will think that the Israelites are wandering around in the country and are closed in by the desert. I will make him stubborn, and he will pursue you. My victory over the king and his army will bring me honor. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. The Israelites did as they were told, right? Because when God chose Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go, here is God calling Moses to do a thing. And when he goes to do the thing, God makes Pharaoh stubborn, which is the king of Egypt. He made Pharaoh stubborn. And I can just imagine what Moses must have felt like. Like, here you are, God, telling me to tell him to let your people go, but then you're making him stubborn and making it that much more difficult for me to convince him to let your people go. But there was a plan and a purpose for all of that, right? A lot of things happened, and God proved or continued proving himself to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh was just like, he wasn't having it. He wasn't believing in any of it. He thought he had much more power than God, than the God that the Israelites were believing in. So it goes on to say, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had escaped, he and his officials changed their minds and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites escape, and we have lost them as our slaves." The king got his war chariot and his army ready. He set out with all his chariots, including the 600 finest commanded by their officers. The Lord made the king stubborn, and he pursued the Israelites, who were leaving triumphantly. The Egyptian army, with all the horses, chariots, and drivers, pursued them and caught up with them where they were camped by the Red Sea, near Pihahiroth and Baal Zephon, which is the location that God said, I want you to just chill out here for now. When the Israelites saw the king and his army marching against them, they were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Weren't there any graves in Egypt? Did you have to bring us out in the desert to die? Look what you have done by bringing us out of Egypt. Didn't we tell you before we left that this would happen? We told you to leave us alone and let us go on being slaves of the Egyptians. It would be better to be slaves there than to die here in the desert." Moses answered, "Don't be afraid. Stand your ground, and you will see what the Lord will do to save you today. You will never see the Egyptians again. The Lord will fight for you, and all you have to do is keep still." Here they are now crying out to God. And although they quickly forgot how faithful God was in leading them, right, with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, but now they're finding themselves in the desert. They're terrified because they see the Egyptian army coming after them. They think that, you know, they're gonna, you know what I mean? And so they're complaining to Moses, and Moses is like, "Listen, don't be afraid. Stand your ground, man up," right? Pretty much. God's gonna do what he said he's gonna do. So the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out for help? Tell the people to move forward. Lift up your walking stick and hold it out over the sea. The water will divide, and the Israelites will be able to walk through the sea on dry ground. I will make the Egyptians so stubborn that they will go in after them, and I will gain honor by victory over the king, his army, his chariots, and his drivers. When I defeat them, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." The angel of God, who had been in front of the army of Israel, moved and went to the rear. The pillar of cloud also moved until it was between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The cloud made it dark for the Egyptians, but gave light to the people of Israel, so the armies could not come near each other all night. Moses held out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. It blew all night and turned the sea into dry land. The water was divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with walls of water on both sides. The Egyptians pursued them and went after them into the sea with all their horses, chariots, and drivers. Just before dawn, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw them into a panic. He made the wheels of their chariots get stuck so that they moved with great difficulty. The Egyptians said, "The Lord is fighting for the Israelites against us. Let's get out of here." The Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your hand over the sea, and the water will come back over the Egyptians and their chariots and drivers." So Moses held out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the water returned to its normal level. The Egyptians tried to escape from the water, but the Lord threw them into the sea. The water returned and covered the chariots, the drivers, and all the Egyptian army that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them was left. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground with walls of water on both sides. On that day, the Lord saved the people of Israel from the Egyptians, and the Israelites saw them lying dead on the seashore. When the Israelites saw the great power with which the Lord had defeated the Egyptians, they stood in awe of the Lord, and they had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. So here is God, right, causing Pharaoh to be stubborn again, to change his mind. And then while all of this is happening, Moses is telling them like, listen, don't be scared. God got you. Then the Lord said, why are you crying out for help? Like, you wasting time right now, my God. Like, you got to do what I told you to do. Use the staff, right? Use the stick that I told you before that I was going to use, and make whatever you thought was impossible, I'm going to make it possible. So with a stick, God uses Moses to use a stick to part the Red Sea. Here they get to the Red Sea. They see that the Egyptians are coming after them. They're thinking like, how are we going to cross the Red Sea? God made a way for them, right? And what they thought was impossible, God made possible by parting the Red Sea. As they're crossing dry ground, here is the sea closing in on the Egyptians, but he made it difficult for them to see what was happening, right? And made it impossible for them made it difficult for the Egyptians to reach or catch up to the Israelites. But it happened with enough, the distance was far enough where the Israelites were able to then cross the Red Sea, but close enough where when the sea closed in, it would close in on them and they would drown. So that's what happened. They drowned. After all of that, there's a chapter 15 that says the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. So they're praising God. It's a song of praise, praising God for his faithfulness, for his power, and for, praising God for victory. But then Exodus 15 verse 22, it says, then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they walked through the desert but found no water. Then they came to a place called Marah, but the water there was so bitter that they could not drink it. That is why it was named Marah. The people complained to Moses and asked, what are we going to drink? Moses prayed earnestly to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, which he threw into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord gave them laws to live by, and there he also tested them. He said, if you will obey me completely by doing what I consider right and by keeping my commands, I will not punish you with any of the diseases that I brought on the Egyptians. I am the Lord, the one who heals you. Next, they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. There they camped by the water. They are traveling in the desert. For 3 days, they walked through the desert, it says, but found no water. They're complaining to Moses. Moses then prays, right? God comes through. And so not only do they have just water, they're led to a place where there's 12 springs and 70 palm trees. And there they camped by the water. They were able to rest, right? It continues on. Exodus 16. The manna and the chaos. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim, and on the 15th day of the second month after they had left Egypt, they came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. There in the desert, they all complained to Moses and Aaron and said to them, we wish that the Lord had killed us in Egypt. There we could at least sit down and eat meat and as much other food as we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve us all to death. The Lord said to Moses, now I am going to cause food to rain down from the sky for all of you. The people must go out every day and gather enough food for that day. In this way, I can test them to find out if they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to bring in twice as much as usual and prepare it. I found that interesting that as they're complaining to Moses, this time Moses doesn't pray to the Lord. The Lord hears them and directly says to Moses, like, now I'm going to cause food to rain down from the sky for all of you. As if like he knew this was going to happen. So now this is what I'm going to do. And then he says, the people must go out every day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I can test them to find out if they will follow my instructions. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, this evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning you will see the dazzling light of the Lord's presence. He has heard your complaints against him, yes, against him, because we are only carrying out his instructions. Then Moses said, it is the Lord who will give you meat to eat in the evening and as much bread as you want in the morning, because he has heard how much you have complained against him. When you complain against us, you are really complaining against the Lord. So I love that Moses says this and he makes it clear, because he could have boasted and said, yeah, God used me to lead you guys out of Egypt. But instead, they're complaining to Moses and they're saying, listen, it ain't going to be me. It's going to be God who's going to continue doing what he's doing, if you guys haven't already realized that. So then it goes on to say, Moses said to Aaron, tell the whole community to come and stand before the Lord, because he has heard their complaints. As Aaron spoke to the whole community, they turned toward the desert, and suddenly the dazzling light of the Lord appeared in a cloud. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them that at twilight they will have meat to eat, and in the morning they will have all the bread they want. Then they will know that I, the Lord, am their God. In the evening, a large flock of cows flew in, enough to cover the camp, and in the morning there was dew all around the camp. When the dew evaporated, there was something thin and flaky on the surface of the desert. It was as delicate as frost. When the Israelites saw it, they didn't know what it was, and they asked each other, what is it? Moses said to them, this is the food that the Lord has given you to eat. The Lord has commanded that each of you is to gather as much of it as he needs, 2 quarts for each member of his household. The Israelites did this, some gathering more, others less. When they measured it, those who gathered much did not have too much, and those who gathered less did not have too little. Each had gathered just what he needed. Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it for tomorrow. But some of them did not listen to Moses and saved part of it. Disobedient. The next morning it was full of worms and smelled rotten, and Moses was angry with them. Every morning each one gathered as much as he needed, and when the sun grew hot, what was left on the ground melted. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much food, 4 quarts for each person. Remember, so it was 2 quarts for each member of his household, yeah. And now 4 quarts for each person. All the leaders of the community came and told Moses about it. And he said to them, the Lord has commanded that tomorrow is a holy day of rest, dedicated to him. Bake today what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Whatever is left should be put aside and kept for tomorrow. As Moses had commanded, they kept what was left until the next day. It did not spoil or get worms in it. Moses said, eat this today, because today is the Sabbath, a day of rest dedicated to the Lord, and you will not find any food outside the camp. You must gather food for 6 days, but on the 7th day, the day of rest, there will be none. On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather food, but they did not find any. Here is God telling them, on the 6th day, you're going to have enough for the 7th day, which is the day that I want you to rest. But instead, they disobeyed again, and they went out to gather food, and they didn't find any. Then the Lord said to Moses, how much longer will you people refuse to obey my commands? Remember that I, the Lord, have given you a day of rest, and that is why on the 6th day I will always give you enough food for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where he is on the 7th day and not leave his home. So the people did no work on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the food manna. It was like a small white seed and tasted like thin cakes made with honey. Moses said, the Lord has commanded us to save some manna to be kept for our descendants, so that they can see the food which he gave us to eat in the desert when he brought us out of Egypt. Moses said to Aaron, take a jar, put 2 quarts of manna in it, and place it in the Lord's presence to be kept for our descendants. As the Lord had commanded Moses, Aaron put it in front of the covenant box so that it could be kept. The Israelites ate manna for the next 40 years until they reached the land of Canaan, where they settled. Wowzers. God continued to show them, and he was testing them. And they kept failing. They kept failing because they kept disobeying. God would tell them to do a thing. They would choose to go about it their own way. But here is God hearing their cry for help, but then also hearing them complain. And it's like, I'm helping you out, but you're choosing to disobey me. You're crying out for me to help you, and I come through, but then you're still choosing to go about things your own way. So then it made me think about the wilderness and just how, many of us have found ourselves there. But before I go on to share like what we experienced in the wilderness and the different lessons that we learned, I then was in this other study Bible that I have, and it breaks down certain things that they experience in the desert. God speaks in the desert. God refines us in the desert, alone in the desert, and dealing with the desert. So it says here, God speaks in the desert. Times in the desert are painful but essential in our walk with the Lord. The desert is the place where God speaks to us and reveals his purposes to us. If it were not for the desert, we could not hear what he has to say. The desert is a place that strips from us all the things we hang on to for comfort, all the things we think we need. Those are exactly the things that we don't need. They keep us from hearing God speak. God refines us in the desert. God never puts us in the blast furnace of the desert to ruin us. He does it to refine us. In the midst of the desert, over time, as the heat sears our hearts, we become refined. I have sometimes had the joyful experience of rubbing shoulders with men and women who have been tempered in the desert. These are the most secure, genuinely humble, godly, gracious, and honest people one can imagine. But it took the desert to make them that way. In the desert, we learn to do things we never dreamed we would have to do. We learn to tolerate and live with realities we never thought we would have to bear. That's all part of the refining of the desert. It's part of God's good plan for us. Alone in the desert. In the desert, Moses learned to stand alone. Later, he would come under attack while standing before the Egyptians and then later the Israelites. They would criticize him, blame him, and reject what he told them. But Moses knew he could stand alone because he had already done it while in the desert. He didn't need a pat on the back. He just pressed on. In solitude and in silence, we gain sensitivity to things we have forgotten. We find ourselves deepening in ways. Oh, my phone's dying, but it's going to continue. We find ourselves deepening in ways we didn't know were possible. We begin to understand the difference between lonely and being alone. We find the strength to carry on even in the absence of public praise. And then dealing with the desert. There are 3 reactions we can have during a time in the desert. The first is to think to yourself, I don't need this. That's the response of pride. A prideful person might see the value of a desert experience for his or her spouse, friend, or coworker, but think that they have no need for one themselves. The second response is, I'm tired of this. Have you ever found yourself there? You may have been in the desert so long that you can't remember anything else. In these moments, it's easy to sink down into discouragement and even despair. The third response is the best one. I accept this. That's the response of maturity. God waits for us to accept where he has placed us. Of course, he doesn't leave us alone in the desert. He is with us even though we can't always sense it. I'm going to continue on because I feel like I have enough time to share the last bit of it and be able to make 2 parts of this video. So, things we will experience in the wilderness. In the wilderness, we may face doubts and questions about our faith. We may wonder why God has allowed us to go through this season and question his plans and purposes. The wilderness can be a spiritually dry season where we feel distant from God and struggle to connect with him. We may experience a lack of spiritual growth and feel stagnant in our relationship with him. The wilderness can be a place of temptation and spiritual warfare, where we may be tempted to doubt God's goodness, give in to sin, or compromise our beliefs. We may face spiritual attacks and need to rely on God's strength to resist and overcome. The wilderness can be a test of our patience and perseverance. We may have to wait for a long time for God's promises to be fulfilled or for the season to end. It can be challenging to remain faithful and trust in God's timing. In the wilderness, we may face difficult decisions and choices. We may need to discern God's will and direction amidst uncertainty and confusion. This can be challenging as we seek to align our choices with God's plan. What we can learn in the wilderness are the following. In the wilderness, we realize our need for God's guidance, provision, and strength. We learn to rely on him completely and trust in his faithfulness. The wilderness can be a humbling experience as we come face to face with our limitations and weaknesses. It reminds us that we are not in control and that we need to submit to God's plans and timing. Just as the Israelites were tested in the wilderness, we may face trials and challenges that test our faith. These experiences can refine and strengthen our trust in God as we learn to lean on him and his promises. The wilderness can be a place of growth and transformation as we learn important lessons and develop character traits such as perseverance, patience, and resilience. It is often in the wilderness that God shapes us into the people he wants us to be. And lastly, the wilderness is often a season of preparation for the next phase of our journey. It is a time of learning, growth, and preparation for the blessings and promises that God has in store for us. And that is all. Toodle.